For over 38 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Repke with BILD Situation Room. We're starting again with images from Kiev from the night before last. We remember Russia launched over 200 missiles, cruise missiles and kamikaze drones at the capital and other Ukrainian cities. Over 12 people lost their lives across the country. We're taking another look at the footage and seeing that new weapons, so to speak, new weapons, were likely used here, which Russia has so far only very rarely used against Ukraine, namely ballistic missiles of North Korean production. According to Ukrainian sources, we can observe the explosions which involve the use of KN-23. North Korean medium-range missiles. 150 units, allegedly, North Korea is said to have provided them to Russia. And we are observing the various explosions from different weapons occurring. So for instance, what we just observed here, something was already fired upon, it was hit, it's burning, and now slowly descending in flames downward. Even with Ukrainian air defense partially active, we can still witness substantial explosions happening right here. What's left over there? And this right here is supposed to be one of those KN-23 missiles that struck Kiev. We know there were several ballistic missile strikes, and according to Ukrainian reports, a total of 30 projectiles were not intercepted on that day. That means it was truly a dark day for Ukraine. We'll see once again at the end what this KN-23 looks like. This is a photo taken from North Korean propaganda, and we can clearly see that it is indeed comparable to an Iskander missile of Russian origin. The Russians don't have as many left, or rather they keep producing them steadily. Nevertheless, of course, many have used them over the last 3 years and are now resupplying, just as they have been with ammunition as well as artillery pieces. Just as they have already received soldiers from North Korea, and now also these ballistic missiles that Russia is using against Ukraine. But it's not just old North Korean missiles being used, but also modern Russian missiles, and that as well. We shouldn't ignore that because alongside these large-scale attacks on cities, there are also repeated targeted strikes by Russia on Ukrainian cities, but then in fact aimed at military targets. And one of these videos that captures this, let's take a closer look now. This is Sumy, a city in northeastern Ukraine, roughly 30 kilometers from the Russian border. And now we're seeing a very precise Russian attack, supposedly with a Tornado-S missile, at least that's what the Russians claim. This is a GLONASS-guided missile, meaning it's coordinated and directed by the Russian satellite system with a range of 120 kilometers, now targeting 3, well, as it appears, very new, very fresh trucks, which are currently parked here in this lot. We're about to witness the explosion, which here is extremely precise. We'll see it occurring right at that spot, exactly where it's intended to strike. And then we'll see the huge fire over Sumy. Of course, we remember that in Sumy, Russia also committed several massacres, and the civilian population was hit right in the center of the city, hitting shops and the university. That's all correct, but at the same time, and this must not be forgotten, alongside these random attacks on civilians, there are also continuous strategic strikes on military targets. Although, of course, 3 trucks are not a strategic target, but nevertheless a worthwhile one for the Russians, who in this case stated that they saw a clear military target there and hit it with great precision. And accordingly, they've now managed to take out at least a small part of Ukraine's military potential, which could theoretically also be deployed against the neighboring regions of Belgorod and Kursk. A small portion of this potential has been destroyed. Let's take another quick look at the map to see that attacks have indeed occurred across the entire country. This means we had the ballistic attacks specifically targeting Kyiv, and we can also observe that the missiles need to have a minimum range of 400 kilometers, these KN-23s, but we also have the possibility for the Russians to attack Sumy, which is only 30 kilometers away from the border. And for that, missiles with a 120-kilometer range are more than sufficient. From the major strategic goals, we now move on to the battlefield here in eastern Ukraine. We move to the Donetsk region and have new footage here that shows just how incredibly dangerous it is for Russian tanks, which are already prepared to fire, meaning they've been driven directly to the front lines, only about 2 to 3 kilometers away from the nearest Ukrainian position. How perilous it is for these Russian tanks. We are looking at the footage from the Ukrainian army, and here we see once again. Yes, quite classic, a T-72B3 tank that's ready, positioned here in a forest clearing preparing to open fire on its designated target. We'll see that shortly, which clearly shows he was already ready to fire. Now we see Ukrainian drones striking here one after another. Once again, we see it's quite rare that the very first drone causes a catastrophic explosion. Instead, we observe no damage at all from this initial strike just now. The Ukrainians have the advantage of using affordable small drones priced at 500 to 1,000 euros each. And with that, they can keep attacking over and over again until, as we see here now, what they want finally happens, which is that the armor is compromised, at least in one spot, and then we see a massive explosion. Now we also see what I had just mentioned earlier, that the ammunition inside the tank catches fire, and then we also see that an uncontrolled shot, as we can see here, is released in this particular direction, which clearly demonstrates that specific measures were taken to ensure that this tank was ready to fire, that it was combat ready, and that it actually could have fired on the Ukrainian position at that moment or very shortly. However, it's extremely dangerous for the Russian forces to try and approach the front line because these small remote-controlled FPV kamikaze drones are specifically there to halt their advance. And not just remote-controlled drones are being used by the Ukrainians now, but also, and this is something special, new fiber-optic drones. We know that for a long time the Russians had a big advantage here because only they were using these drones. Now, the Ukrainian army, as I observed during my visit about 5 weeks ago, is increasingly incorporating fiber-optic drones into their arsenals, that the different units are currently training with them and, of course, deploying these drones. And here we see a deployment in Yasenove, located near the area between Andriivka and Pokrovsk. And we see that this small Ukrainian drone here flies right into a building. On the right side, we observe this so-called garage, which refers to this heavily fortified main battle tank visible here on the cannon, and here a BMP-2, which is also being attacked by the Ukrainians. And we can observe this extremely precise approach. This means you don't have to target the armor from the outside, but instead you can directly aim and fly straight into the open hatch. And now we see here, this is the BMP-2 from earlier completely destroyed. And so the Ukrainians can now also attack with precision using fiber-optic drones. However, and this is crucial to mention, the units don't have nearly as much as the Russians do. We know, of course, that some Russian units here are equipped with thousands of them. For the Ukrainians, from what I've personally seen, I'd say the ratio is about 90% still radio-controlled drones and 10% fiber-optic drones. Right now at the front, among the various units in Donetsk at least. We'll still take a closer look at the entire situation on the map, see once more exactly where it all occurred, and also assess the range of these small drones. We're here in a region where yesterday we already looked at the destruction of a BM-21 about 20 kilometers behind the front line, and now we're seeing that the attack just took place in Yasenove. And if we look up there, that's 4 kilometers, then it's about, if we consider this, let's assume it was fired from here, then it's maybe about 5-6 kilometers, which this drone can achieve. That's really quite remarkable for such a small fiber optic drone. However, the reality is that it's considerably much less, as you absolutely require this fiber optic cable connection. Normally, a roll is about 10 kilometers long. That means you would have to connect several, and it becomes increasingly risky the farther you fly with it. We observed it yesterday in that specific area. The BM-21 was destroyed, and naturally, we achieved a much higher range in that situation. Still, the Ukrainians are expanding their arsenal to now strike with fiber optics as well. And these attacks on the Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers along the front are leading the Russians to increasingly resort to alternative vehicles. In some cases, vehicles that one might not have expected in a war at all, such as motorcycles. Here's a new Ukrainian army video. Hope it's all clear. At least the Russian flags are visible, but hopefully one can also see that beneath each of them, motorcycles are actively moving, 5 in total. We can see them not just positioned behind the front, but clearly traveling from A to B. But this is an actual attack. This is an assault by the Russian army on a Ukrainian position directly at the front. Here we still see, if I'm correct, only 4 of the motorcycles. The last one will soon follow and join the others. However, we can now see that the Ukrainians are actively targeting these motorcycles, that they are attacking here with artillery, but also with drones, and indeed the position that is to be stormed. We don't know if it has been located, whether it has just been reached by the motorcycles. However, right at this very moment, we see it clearly. Both the 5 motorcycles and the 5 dismounted infantrymen are currently under attack here by the Ukrainian army, in this case with many small grenades dropped by drones. This entire situation repeatedly underscores the significant difficulties the Russians encounter in deploying their own tanks and armored vehicles to the front lines. They're running low there. We know that an APC or even a tank costs at least $1 million or euros. Motorcycles are significantly cheaper. That's why the Russians are now substituting the tanks, APCs, and other protected vehicles they've lost. Once again, we're seeing it result in lethal consequences for the Russian troops involved. And how dangerous not only the transport to the front but also away from the front is for the wounded Russian soldiers in this case is shown in the following video. We'll just let it keep running like this. It's pretty wild, I have to say. It's displaying an off-road vehicle here. Once again, not an ambulance and definitely not a protected type of vehicle. We don't even manage to spot a roof carrying 2 wounded Russian soldiers on it. We're pixelating this one here because he's got an injury to his leg. The other one over here also has a wound on his leg. And now, however, the issue is that they are not restrained, they're not being held down, there's also no roof, and that's why we're entering a truly fatal situation for these 2 Russians here. Apparently the roads are in such poor condition that one of them is now being hurled in a high arc out of this makeshift ambulance. The other one rushes or runs over to him trying to help, and we're about to see how he reaches him, and it seems he's not dead but gets up and is later barely but still on his feet. More severely wounded than he was before. Nevertheless, we can replay it. These are truly wild and intense scenes, showing the supposedly the second strongest army in the world heavily relies on medevac or medical evacuation from the front to safely extract their soldiers in such a manner and under these conditions. And this entire situation, particularly when you bring to mind the motorcycles mentioned earlier, truly speaks volumes about the present strength and condition of the Russian army, not only within the context of Ukraine. And even if we've just seen that the Russian army is struggling, both in terms of its offensives and its medical evacuations, the symbolism of a supposedly victorious and mighty army, it is still there, and it is also present in completely destroyed Ukrainian cities. We are looking at footage from Bachmut, and these are recordings made, I believe, by even somewhat disbelieving Russian soldiers who are currently stationed in that particular region. These are posters that were put up for May 9th. We see here marking 80 years since that significant day. Great victory. So these are the commemorations of the 80th anniversary of the victory over the Nazi dictatorship in Europe. And we can see that this city here, Bachmut, formerly with 76,000 inhabitants, has been completely destroyed, entirely deserted. Nonetheless, the Russians are actively celebrating here with propaganda posters that have been strategically put up to mark the 9th of May is our victory day. We are celebrating, and we are also seeing once again, this isn't just limited to World War II, it's stated to extend all the way until 2025. So of course they want to evoke symbolism here. We are still at war, we are still fighting against fascism, as Russian propaganda claims, yet all around us we see only ruins. That means this is what Russia consistently refers to as the so-called liberation. Again, here it says it's Victory Day. May 9th is written on top. That means it's being portrayed as if this completely deserted city, this emptied city where 70,000 or at least 70 out of 76,000 people have fled or were killed and no longer live there because the city lies in ruins. As if this were now a part of Russia or a liberated territory, and as if one were now celebrating here that Russia, of course, rightly fought against Nazi Germany back then, but also implying a similar justification today, but is also now, under the guise of fighting fascism, destroying cities throughout Ukraine. It's really quite peculiar footage showing even some Russians reacting with a mix of disbelief and subtle sarcasm, almost as if they're questioning it themselves. They themselves can hardly believe the completely ruined city is now being plastered with propaganda posters. Nevertheless, we can clearly observe that at least the Russian state propaganda is striving to portray this entire scenario as if they are now in the so-called liberated territory, actually destroyed and depopulated Ukraine, also celebrating the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in this case. Let's take a look at one final video that shows us how the Ukrainian military intelligence is not only active in their own country, but also in Russia. They released a video yesterday in which we can see that in Rostov-on-Don, at an airfield in that region, they apparently either had their own operative stationed or successfully recruited someone on the ground. Maybe a Russian citizen who deliberately sets fire to a Sukhoi Su-30 SM that had been parked and remained stationary at that very airfield for more than 3.5 years. Now we first see photos of this aircraft from various perspectives. And now we see here, this is a satellite image which has also been verified. This Su-30 is positioned right at the front. Let's take a moment to clarify that once more. But here already you can spot the first civilians. That means there's a small village situated near this Air Force base in Rostov-on-Don. And we can clearly observe that it's only about 50 meters that someone has walked, starting from the edge of this military zone or directly on the military airfield itself. And we can now clearly observe that the individual has positioned themselves directly between the engines of this Su-30 SM, marked with the number 35, and has placed an incendiary device there. The whole thing is a bit strange at first because it clearly demonstrates that Ukrainian agents or saboteurs hired by them, including Russian collaborators, are indeed capable of infiltrating and successfully operating within Russian military bases with relative ease and minimal detection. They found it stood there for 3.5 years. That means it was no longer in active use, which also suggests why it was placed so far on the edge of the airport. Nevertheless, a new Su-30SM costs around 50 million euros, and these older aircraft positioned there continue to serve as a critical spare parts repository, providing essential components for the newer models as well as the other planes actively in operation today and still flying. Thus, another significant blow for the Russians, who lose an aircraft not over Ukraine in the air but on the ground in Russian territory.